people to know. I get a lot of messages from people, hey, can you ask this scholar this question or that scholar this question? And many scholars, don't communicate to the general public like that. Very few actually put themselves out there. And one of those is you, actually. And what I mean by that is they can have access to content that is not public, that is specifically for patrons. I'm one of your patrons, just so everybody knows. Consider going, because his first book, which how much did the publisher, how much are they charging for that book?
It's still $126 on Amazon, as far as I know.
And it's accessible just for joining, right? On the Patreon?
Absolutely. Yep. It's free to members, and giving 20% off the new book, Found Christianities. There's a little flyer you can get access to, and there's a code that you can grab 20% off that book.
Wow. Okay. I'm excited. I just joined. Please consider joining. You can ask him questions. You can comment on the post, and he will, when he has the opportunity, he's a busy guy, always writing another book, reading another book, doing this or that. He'll definitely respond to it and get that. If you haven't got some of his works, I highly recommend it on Amazon. The Evil Creator has blown my mind. It's blown Neil from Gnostic Informants. It's blown Dr. Robert M. Price's mind. He was just like, whoa, never heard of this stuff, some of it. And he really enjoyed that. So please consider going and getting a copy of something, because there's every book you see up here has amazing information.
It's a pleasure to be here. And dating the Gospels and other documents in the New Testament is really, actually, it's a mystery to most people. It was a mystery to me for a long time. And so it's a real pleasure that I can get to go through some of the logic of the dating with folks. And I apologize in advance if I'm going to be throwing a lot of information at you. Just bear with me, and throw in a question, and we'll go from there.
All right, I'm putting it up on the screen.
Okay, yeah. So this is just a quick PowerPoint here on dating Luke Acts in light of Marcion. And I'm just going to go through some of the basic data here. So are we seeing all this?
We are. Yep. Can I mention one thing about Marcion before we even go any further?
Absolutely.
We just did a recording for everybody who's interested on Marcion. So go join Dr. Litwa's Patreon.
Yeah, so if you want to learn more about Marcion, join the Patreon, grab Found Christianities. He's chapter 14. I really want to also sing Dr. Mason's praises here. There's a nice myth vision. I think it's like 2.5 hours long, of him going through why Luke and Acts is dependent on Josephus. And I am just going to assume that material, okay? But you guys can go back and check that out on Myth Vision, okay? Search for that. Basically, Josephus finishes up his Antiquities about 94, okay? So if Luke and Acts are dependent on Josephus, then they have to be dated after 93 or 94, okay? So please don't believe anyone who just glibly says that Acts was written in the 60s, okay? Or that Luke Acts is written in the 80s, okay? Even that won't stand scrutiny, okay?
I've heard Dr. Ehrman actually say that, and I'm like, huh? I think he's just a little outdated on Acts in terms of dating Acts, personally. But
not responsible, in my opinion. So the earliest known manuscripts of Acts date to the 3rd century CE. Okay, so we could determine when something is early if we had something early, and on occasion, very rarely, we do get a 2nd century manuscript of some New Testament document. That is not the case for Acts, okay? Only in the 3rd century there. And I've thrown up my references here in case any of you want to check them out. Feel free. You'll find a lot more information. In fact, the really interesting thing about Acts is there's zero evidence to prove that anybody used it until after 150. And this has been demonstrated, I think, really well by Andrew Gregory in a book called The Reception of Luke and Acts. This is really important data here, folks, because what it means is that out of all the early Christian authors that we have, and there are lots, none of them can be proven to use Acts until after the year 150. So when you're trying to date a book, you can't be throwing this back into the 60s or even the 90s or even the 120s without really taking this into account. Okay, so there's some data for you. Chew on that. Now, as for Marcion, okay, and again, we've done an episode on Marcion. He'll be on the Patreon. Marcion is third generation Christian, reaches maturity about 120, lives to about 160. Okay, his text that he had with him in Pontus, which is north central Turkey, was an early form of what's now called the Gospel according to Luke, but without the name. And this is an important point, that all the names for the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are all late and derivative. They're not original with the actual writing. Okay, so Marcion's reading a text, some people, the Evangelion, some call it Proto-Luke, but it's not called Luke, and that's the most important thing, okay? He brings this text, again, the Evangelion, to Rome, and he publishes it together about 145 with 10 Pauline letters, okay? Now, what's important about this is, and many people think that this really is the first New Testament. It's the first collection which combines a gospel plus letters. And that's really the form that the New Testament later takes, except in the later form, you've got, incredibly, 4 gospels, none of which agree entirely. And you've got a bunch of other letters, a lot of them pseudepigraphical, meaning that they're written under a false name. Now, for Marcion, he had just 11 books in his collection. Okay, so, and he also, very importantly, he thought that it was crazy if you had 4 gospels. Okay, especially 4 gospels that don't even agree with each other. No, he was extremely certain about this one point, that there was one single gospel, and that was a gospel that was Pauline. That is a gospel that Paul had preached. And Paul, if you look up some of these references, is constantly referring to his own gospel in the singular. And he refers to my gospel, okay, not others' gospels. And Paul is majorly concerned that other people have different gospels and are distorting them, okay? So Marcion is a good reader of Paul, and he is familiar with the idea that Paul has a single gospel, okay, and it's his gospel, and Marcion thinks it's corrupted at an early point. The reason he thinks that is he's just simply a good reader of Paul, okay? So you go to Galatians, and Paul says, those troubling you wish to pervert the gospel of Christ, okay? Now, what's interesting is he's got these opponents who are already perverting the gospel of Christ in Paul's own lifetime, and Galatians is even an early letter. And who are these troublers? Well, interestingly enough, just a few verses later, we learn that they are the apostles, James and James's party, and Peter. And this is really incredible because it's James who is polluting the gospel by saying that early Christians have to follow the law. And Paul is not on board with this and has a public rant against Peter right in front of his face in Antioch. Very well known. So when Marcion, is growing up, he encounters the one singular gospel in his area, the Evangelion. He is aware that other gospels are beginning to circulate in the late 1st and early 2nd century, but he understands these not as, the more the merrier. He understands these as perversions of the original Pauline gospel or the Evangelion, okay? Now, a really important distinction here, because there's lots of misinformation about Marcion, mostly because of heresiologists making claims that aren't true. Marcion did not claim that he corrected or modified what he considered to be distortions in the Evangelion or Proto-Luke or any other gospel. Okay, Marcion isn't primarily an editor, and he never claims to be an editor or a writer of his gospel. Okay, it's only later heresiologists who are claiming that Marcion, and they use the term, mutilated the text of canonical Luke, that is the Luke that we have today, by cutting out things like the virgin birth in places where there's these Old Testament passages and figures and where Jesus seems very friendly to the Jewish law. Okay, that stuff, they say, Marcion cut out. Turns out that's not really true, because when you go back to Marcion's Evangelion, and thankfully, very unlike Q, the Q document, the Marcion's Evangelion is not a hypothetical document. It's a real document that has to be reconstructed because it's quoted dozens, actually hundreds of times. And so from these quotes, we can reconstruct what was in there. And we can definitely see that what was in there was Old Testament passages and figures. And a great example of this is the Transfiguration, where you've got Moses and Elijah appearing right next to Jesus. And for the heresiologists, they're like, well, that stuff shouldn't be in there because Marcion doesn't like the Old Testament. Therefore, Moses and Elijah shouldn't even be there. But guess what? They were, and the heresiologists were really confused about this point. So I'm now going more from the facts to the level of theory. Okay, so follow the narrative with me, and we'll get to your questions very soon. Derek, if you want to stop me at any point, that's totally fine too. But what the theory is that the theory of how we got canonical Luke, okay, which is the Luke in the New Testament today, is that an unknown editor took the Evangelion, or if you prefer Proto-Luke, that's not really accurate, but he took the Evangelion and he expanded it with a preface, a birth narrative with the famous virgin birth, a genealogy, and other elements, okay? And this editor then attached this new updated Luke, okay, to his own composition, the book of Acts, which was deliberately crafted as a sequel. Hence, for the very first time, you have Luke Acts that start to be read together. Okay, so whereas formerly, this is very important, the Evangelion isn't connected to the book of Acts, an editor after Marcion, about 150, combines it and then basically gives us the first life of Jesus plus the earliest church history, as it were. And what's interesting about this church history is we see that time and time again, it counters Marcion's understanding, because Marcion's understanding was that Judaizers had come in after Paul had preached his gospel and had corrupted that gospel. And lo and behold, Acts portrays Paul pretty much as a Judaizer. Okay, so it's got Paul following Jewish customs, whereas the real Paul would never have circumcised Timothy. The author of Acts has him circumcising Timothy. The author of Acts even has Paul following a Nazirite vow to shave his head and go sacrifice in the Jerusalem temple. Not something the real Paul would have done. That is, when he became a Christian. So every chance the author has to connect Christianity with the Old Testament history, promises, and heritage, the author of Acts takes it, okay? And this is a very particular editorial move, okay? He is very deliberately trying to connect Paul back to the Jewish heritage and the practice of the Jewish law because, so the theory, he is actively opposing, okay, a Marcionite version of who Paul was and what that early history of Christianity was. And he is revising Marcion and pushing back very deliberately without naming Marcion, okay? Now, why wouldn't you name Marcion if you're writing in the mid-2nd century? Well, because you're imitating somebody in the mid-1st century. You're imitating Luke. So if, you will completely blow your cover if you talk about Marcion, okay? You see the logic. Let's talk about this. So Marcion then, according to the theory, counters this addition of Luke plus Acts with a book that he called Antitheses, which showed that the gods of the Old and New Testaments, okay, he didn't use those terms, but basically that's the easiest way to get it. The gods of the Old and New Testaments were never the same, okay? And this is really important for Marcion's theology, okay? And in this book, Marcion claims quite openly that Luke is a corrupt gospel.
Ooh.
And that the very name Luke was added as a false title. Okay. Now, this is what Marcion is saying. Okay. And he should know. All right. Because he's there, right there, when these events are happening, when this document appears. Okay. Marcion claims, and this is his language, that the Evangelion was falsified by the upholders of Judaism. Now, who are the upholders of Judaism for Marcion? Well, they're actually not Jews. Marcion didn't have any problem with Jews. He had a problem with early Catholics who wished to make the Evangelion, now transformed into canonical Luke, into a single corpus with the law and the prophets. That is what we call the Old Testament, tacked on to the front. And why do they want to do this, says Marcion? They want to do this so that Jesus is seen as the son of the Judean deity, okay? They want to have Old Testament, then New Testament, because they think that the Judean deity, the creator, is actually the Father of Jesus Christ. And they're wrong. Okay. So this is what Marcion is actually arguing. So it's not that Marcion is the corrupter, and from his own perspective, it's that the early Catholics are corrupting the gospel, essentially by attaching it to the Old Testament, something which should have never happened, and by updating it so that it's written by this pseudo sub-apostolic person called Luke. And that's was really weird for Marcion, because Marcion's Evangelion, he knew, or at least assumed, that was earlier than canonical Luke. Because Marcion's Evangelion didn't use an apostolic name. It didn't need one. It was simply the Gospel of Paul. Where does this sub-apostolic name come from? Well, it actually comes from these lay and pseudepigraphical epistles like Colossians 4:14 and 2 Timothy 4:11. Now, interestingly, if you look these up, and I encourage you, you'll see that 2 Timothy 4:11 is the only passage where Luke is Paul's faithful companion. And this is interesting. In this passage, everybody else has left Paul, and Paul says, Luke alone is with me. Okay, so Luke alone is the faithful companion. And this is exactly how he's portrayed in Acts, in the we sections of Acts, where all of a sudden the author pretends to be Luke and starts talking in the first person. We sailed here. We went here. We then did this. We did this, as if he's a companion of Paul. Now, when is 2 Timothy written? Okay. Well, 2 Timothy is at best, okay, early 2nd century. I'd put it anywhere safely between 130 and 150. I definitely lean toward, somewhere in that 140-ish region. So basically, what we can tell is that the author of Luke, the person who slaps on the name Luke to the Evangelion, is familiar with 2 Timothy. So we know that he's past about at least the year 130. Okay. So this is how we reconstruct how this is happening. He uses this character from 2 Timothy and pretends to be that character, Luke, the so-called doctor. Okay. Now here's an additional factor. And this is a bit unique to me. And, I've done an episode on Simon of Samaria with Neil's show, Gnostic Informant. And I introduced a document there called the Great Declaration Commentary. Okay. And this is in a book I've translated called The Refutation of All Heresies. There's a long story here. But basically, this book is written after 135, probably, the Great Declaration Commentary. And this book is the only book to connect the great power to Simon. Now, lo and behold, when you get to Acts and reading Acts chapter 8, okay, Simon is called the power called great. He's called the great power. Now, the question is then, where is the author of Acts getting that title? The only attestation of the title is in this book called The Great Declaration Commentary, and we can date it, thankfully, and I'll tell you why, but we can date this to 130 and 135. So we know that Acts must be later. Okay. Now, I'll just finish up here, and we'll run into questions. But I don't want to leave you, thinking that I have this infallible theory. This is a theory, and I'm giving you the logic for the theory so that you can go then critique it and decide for yourselves. Okay, and I'm also going to give you some suggestions for further reading that's going to help you make your own decisions. Okay, so don't take it from me. Go and read some of these books. Okay, the first one is highly recommended. Jason Badun's The First New Testament. This is the attempt to actually translate Marcion's Evangelion into English. Okay, excellent. Check it out. Marcus Vincent, Marcion and the Dating of the Synoptic Gospels. Check it out. Purvo's Dating Acts. He dates at about 120, 125. Check it out. Tyson's Marcion and Luke Acts. Really important book. Unfortunately, has a sort of outdated view of Marcion, but it's still a good book. And then very new, just translated from the German, is Matthias Klinghart's The Oldest Gospel. And he's got a theory that'll really knock your socks off. I don't go all the way where Klinghart goes. And I'm happy to talk about that more. But basically, Matthias Klinghart thinks that Marcion's Evangelion is even older than Mark and is actually the source of Mark. I don't buy that for a minute. But it is important to know that the Evangelion is the source of canonical Luke, and that's what I've tried to show here. So, wow, huge mouthful. Sorry for all that information. You're probably totally brain dead, and we can all go home, right?
No, you underestimate Myth Vision. Let me tell you, we love this stuff, and we are definitely picking up what you're putting down, and we are tracking.
Excellent.
The way you have done this, are you one of the few people who's actually taken this kind of stance and this way? Or have you convinced any other scholars to say, man, you might have something to this?
Well, I'm not actually an Acts scholar, so I haven't written an article on this. But when you look at the recent literature on Acts, you do see a very steady movement. It hasn't quite trickled down to the general population. So, your preacher might still tell you that, Acts is written in 60 or,
Right.
80.
They're never going to stop
but that is becoming increasingly implausible. Okay. And good scholars who are up to date on the literature won't tell you that Acts is written around 80 or 85. Okay. That's no longer responsible. But most are going to put it in that gray zone between 100 and 125. Okay, there's actually, a very recent German article I've just read or tried to read. It's very dense, but that's basically the sense that the person writing this could not have been earlier than Josephus, and there you go. So he has to be about 100 or later. And if you don't want to go all the way with me up into the 140s and 150, fine. But the responsible position is we're no longer in the 80s here, folks. That's no longer responsible.
There goes half of the Christian apologetic community right there. I did create an image I wanted to show, and feel free to super chat your questions if you have any. Here is the image I made before we started, me and my buddy, Steven Nelson, okay? Highly technical, but for anybody who's interested, these are the 4 earliest manuscripts that we have, like any papyri, like data of Acts, right? Or Luke Acts, if you will, the Orthodox version that we carry today. P4, P75, P69, P48, and the P4, P75 is, from what my friend understands, maybe you can correct us here, late 2nd, early 3rd century is from what he understood. And I'd have to remove this banner for a second here real quick to show that's the Alexandrian text. Then the Western text is like early 3rd century, and that's P69, P48, just showing fragments of that in particular. Do you happen to, would you say both categories are in 3rd century at this point, according to scholarship?
Well, these datings are, the important thing to know is that these datings are based on one of 2 factors. Either they've run a carbon-14 test on the papyrus itself, or they're dating it by the handwriting. Okay.
Right.
So you've got 21st century handwriting. Someone 2,000 years from now can say, oh, well, we found Derek's notebook and he writes with a 21st century hand. And so, but the thing is, when you're dating by handwriting, as in the vast majority of cases, it's a range. So that's why you see these huge ranges. So, second to third century, well, geez, that's technically a 200-year range. So, I mean, is that what's really accurate there? So you have to pay attention to the range. You can never pinpoint it. And the same thing with carbon-14 dating. If you got a carbon-14 dating of 200, the year 200 CE, well, that's always plus or minus 50 years, because the test itself doesn't give you, obviously, the exact date. It's not like you put it through a carbon-14 test and it says, yes, written September 14th at 8 a.m. In the year 200.
Right.
I mean, no, that's not how the test works. It gives you an approximate date, and then you go plus or minus 50 years on either end. So if something is dated to about 200, it could have been written 250, could have been written 150.
Right.
So keep those ranges in mind, and always know that all those dates are really disputable. And the book that I really recommend for those who want to learn about papyri is Brent Nonbre's God's Library. Go check that out. That's got all your facts and data.
So one comment on this in particular is, and I'm just reading what me and my friend Stephen were going over earlier. He talks about the dating of the Alexandrian witnesses ranges from late second to early third century. The dating of the Western witnesses is in the early third century. And so the question kind of is maybe getting your thoughts on. So if Luke Acts was originally composed, say, circa 150 AD, the break in the text types, Alexandrian, Western, must have taken place very early in the process of textual transmission. What do you think?
Yeah. So, and now I'll just lay my cards down on the table here. I am not a text critic. Okay.
Right.
There are people who study this full time. I will give you the basic information about text criticism that I myself learned. Okay. And these text types, all right, there's increasingly distrust about the consistency of the text types. So if someone is wanting to make an argument really strongly based on text types, like, oh, the Alexandrian, or the Witness, or the Western, or the Byzantine, this really, it's actually not that helpful for dating. There's a general really rough sense of text types, but there's not enough consistency to really say either way. So what you want to date by is not text types, but by handwriting or by a carbon-14 test. But I will say that in terms of Marcion, this is a lot more complex than just saying, well, here's when Luke Acts were written, because it's not just about Luke and canonical Luke here, folks. It's about the Evangelion. Now, the Evangelion could be very easily, 100 CE. But canonical Luke is 150-ish or 140-ish, okay? So canonical Luke is your update. So if you find a manuscript of something that looks like Luke, let's say that tomorrow we find something that looks like Luke, and it's dated to 125, and then someone says, well, haha, Litwa was wrong, Well, no, because the theory is that there is a proto-Luke that is in Marcion's time, which is around 100, and that canonical Luke is an update that's post-Marcion. Right. And Marcion's ministry is active starting in about 130. So all we have here are ranges, folks. But the basic thing is the dating of the current manuscripts doesn't help anybody because they're all late second century. So there you go.
Even then, there's still a couple of go ahead.
Yeah, no, exactly. They're at best late second century, but they're probably third in my money.
Yeah. I was thinking about this. Even if we grant it, let's pretend he actually created this proto-gospel, which, there's some people who want to argue that he created it. That would still put it in like 130-ish, right, at best, and that there's a updated version of that, which if you were to try and say he did that, which he's saying no, he received. How did he get this proto? And then I'd like to get to these super chats. How did he get this gospel? Does he mention that, or do we don't know?
Marcion never says that he got the gospel. He just says this is the gospel. So we have to make a scholarly intuition here, and the intuition is that this is simply the gospel that existed in Marcion's time in the area of Pontus. It's simply the gospel that he grew up with. It's the gospel that was written. It's the gospel that he was familiar with, maybe even as a child. And this is the gospel that he knew, and this is the gospel that he thought was a Pauline gospel. Okay. He never claims to have written anything. I think that would have shocked Marcion. He wants this to be Pauline. He doesn't want it to be his. And he also never claims to have edited anything. Okay. The only thing that Marcion claims is that somebody corrupted his gospel and made it into canonical Luke.
Maybe he was so successful that they were not liking it. Now let's borrow this from him and then make it better if we can. John James Baldridge, thank you for the super chat, my friend. Seriously, all the support, everybody here, you help keep us going. And his question is, can you comment on how the events of the time, namely the Kitos War, or Kitos, 115 to 117, and Bar Kokhba Revolt, 132 to 135, shaped Marcion's writing, popularity, and politics, and the effect they had on the books? Ooh, I don't know if you can answer all these questions, but that is a good question in light of what's going on with the Jews at the moment.
Yep. So absolutely. It's a great question. Really appreciate it, John. So yes, absolutely. Between 115 and 135, it is not the best moment for the Jewish people. Okay. These are two massive wars. One is in the diaspora, that is in Egypt. There's a massacre, a pogrom of over 1 million Jews in Alexandria, massive death and bloodshed. And then for Bar Kokhba, you have this awful slaughter in Palestine itself. Okay, so the Jews are getting killed left and right. They're not very popular. They're sometimes said, I think very, very wrongly, that Marcion himself is anti-Jewish and that he feeds into the overall political anti-Jewish sentiment. I don't think so. And in fact, what's interesting is that if you read the heresiologist, Tertullian is constantly making the claim that, Marcion is using Jewish arguments, and Marcion is a friend of the Jews, and we don't like that. So it's not that Marcion is in any way anti-Jewish. He just he thinks that Jesus was a Jew. He just thinks that Jesus didn't follow the Jewish law, and the point of Christianity is to overcome the law and overcome these lesser deities, among them the Creator. And conceivably, political events might have led him and made more plausible the belief that the Judean deity was like this minor warlike deity who's constantly encouraging his people to throw off the yoke of Rome and to do all this crazy messianic stuff. Possibly that's feeding into Marcion, absolutely, but my money is that he's also just a very good reader of the Jewish scripture, and so he can see how Yahweh or the Judaic deity behaves, and that behavior then convinces him that this is not a good God. So Marcion's battle is against the Judaic God. He says almost nothing against the Judean people, and he doesn't really seem to care that much. So yeah, that's at least an approach to answering that question. But it's very important, and I appreciate you bringing up the political context, because it's very different than our own. So that's really important.
Thank you, John. By the way, before this, we did a pre-recording that's going to end up on his Patreon, where he actually makes a few points that Marcion says, which kind of backs up this idea that why he thinks this God is evil and stuff. It's really interesting. So consider joining his Patreon again. Shameless plug. I'm a Suradondai. I don't know. I'm totally butchering your name. Maybe you can help me here. Don't know if you could pronounce his name properly, but he says, finally happened upon the live show. Love Myth Vision. Love Dr. Litwa. Keep it up. Thank you so much, my friend. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Seriously. Thank you for that support. Vaguely agnostic with the 666. Thank you for that super chat, my friend. When I was a believer, the New Testament was written by people who knew Jesus. I am old. Is there anything in the Bible written by anyone who actually knew Jesus?
Well, this is the great this is a great question, and I have to laugh because most of the documents of the New Testament, I think, are getting us into very late, but mostly early to mid second century. And by the second century, there's this overwhelming desire to attribute your letters to these apostles who have been dead for now almost 100 years. You think of like the epistle of Second Peter. Who's ever writing Second Peter and attributing it to Peter is writing about 100 years after Peter actually lived. Okay, so the answer to this question really depends on what you mean by new Jesus, because I think Paul, if we had a time machine, we could ask him, and we could also speak ancient Greek, he would say, I absolutely knew Jesus, but the reality is he might not have ever seen Jesus, that is, in the flesh. Okay. And the way that Paul knew Jesus was through his visions. And so, I mean, would we say that means actual personal knowledge? Well, probably not, but I guess it depends. So, I mean, it's sort of like, does a wife whose husband has died and she thinks that her husband comes back to her every day and has a long conversation, does she still know her husband personally? Well, maybe, I don't know. But the only person with a bare chance of being in the New Testament who knew Jesus would be Paul. Okay. And Paul only has 7 widely accepted, that is, genuine letters. Okay. And all the rest is either pseudepigraphy or it's ascribed to later apostolic figures. So that's where we are.
There's your answer. Thank you so much, Vaguely Agnostic. I appreciate the super chat. Constellation Pegasus. Good to see you, my friend. Thank you for the super chat. It's infuriating and embarrassing. I never knew of these things as a Jehovah's Witness.
No surprise there. Yeah.
Hey, Constellation.
They're not going to tell you. I mean, they are not going to tell you. Okay. I mean, unless you are wanting to be shunned and do your own research, nobody's going to volunteer this information. I mean, you've got the whole churches based on suppressing the scholarly, actual historical information because they want to believe and assert the apostolicity of all these texts in the New Testament. That is, that they're actually written by apostles or people who knew apostles. They're not going to volunteer information that's going to undermine that.
Yeah.
Never.
Man, I'm going to tell you what, that's hilarious. Because if you want to find, I mean, Constellation, you've been hanging out with me long enough. If you want to find stuff from critical scholars, we bring it right here. I mean, we're pushing the boundaries of what wasn't permitted or acceptable. And we're also trying to pull back on when we go too far on certain things. Just to give you an example, Heavenbound has, this dude is in the minority with this view, right? They would say you're in the minority with your view. Now, as far as critical scholarship goes, where do they date this? They're all mainly past, 95 at least? Is it like acceptable and consensus critical scholarship that Acts is written after Josephus in 95?
Well, even if you don't accept the dependence on Josephus, there are other very good reasons for believing that it is around 120. And I think that scholarship has moved in the direction of early second century. Now, there are some scholars who aren't up to date on the literature, but those who are, I think, are very gradually moving toward early second century. So yes, I'm happy to be in the minority. That's totally fine with me. But I'm also, the point of this episode is to give you the rationale for how scholars think and why they think what they think, okay? So that you now then have the tools to fish, as it were, and to think seriously about, well, how do scholars date these things? Because it is based on just a bunch of inductive reasoning and comparing who's who and who's speaking when and who's writing when, and you've got to reconstruct everything, and it's really, really hard work, okay? So if you're willing to do the work, you can come up with your own conclusion. But definitely we've moved in terms of the consensus, I think, into the early 2nd century at least. And I'd go pick up Richard Purvow's Dating Acts, okay? And he gives you a whole bunch more reasons why beyond the Josephus thing. So if you don't want to agree with Steve Mason on Josephus, that's fine. There's at least 8 or 9 other reasons why we think it's early 2nd century. Okay.
Wow.
And that's to do based on the actual language that this author is using, because you're going to blow your cover, right? If I'm pretending to write a letter of Abraham Lincoln, I'm going to drop something in there, even if I'm trying to pretend that I'm a man of 1855. I'm inevitably going to drop something in there, use some kind of word or language that just wasn't familiar in 1855.
Even grammatically something or somehow, yeah.
And I'm going to blow my cover, right? That's what happens in this sort of exercise. So you better believe that we can figure this out.
Ooh, love it. Constellation Pegasus, thank you, my friend. I appreciate all the super chats. And he says, this channel is equal to taking college classes. Incredible job, Derek. Not only that, that's why I said up front on Dr. Litwa's Patreon, you can ask these questions. You can actually explore deeper with him by helping and go support. And when he has the opportunity, because he's always working and stuff, and he jumps on there, he'll be able to answer and stuff like that. So please consider doing so. It is in the description, and I'll make sure that I actually post a link here in just a second. That way everybody knows how to find you. But I do want to mention, since we have no Patreon, or it's Patreon, I'm putting the Patreon here, no super chats at the moment. I was going to ask you, it seems like in your argument, there's some interesting Marcion situation with reworking Marcion's, or the gospel that Marcion has. And he's going, that ain't the gospel. So he's trying to speak through these heresiologists that deny him a voice, so to speak. They're mentioning him through their refutation of him, so to speak. He's still screaming through there, and we can hear him today. Like, it seems like there's a lot of weight there to put it from just early 2nd century to later because of this Marcion thing. Wouldn't you? Is that what you're doing?
Well, yes and no. So Marcion, again, he thrives between 120 and 150. So if you want to say that it's an earlier response to Marcion, that's fine. You could still put it around 125, 130, the response. But just know that it's response. Marcion is, okay, and this is absolutely true, okay? You go get Jason Badun's work, and I got it right here, okay? First New Testament, okay? You pick it up, you read the translation of Marcion's Evangelion. You will quickly realize that everything in canonical Luke is an addition, okay? 99% of canonical Luke is simply an expansion on the Evangelion, okay? So we know that whoever wrote canonical Luke is 99% of the time adding something, and only 1% of the time removing stuff that he didn't like, okay? So when Marcion, who by his time, he's obviously familiar with the Gospel of Matthew, he becomes familiar with canonical Luke and is like, what is this? This is my gospel with a bunch of other crap tacked on. And it's tacked on by somebody who has a consistent editorial purpose to make me look bad. That is to connect Jesus to obedience to the Torah, which is the same thing that the Gospel of Matthew does, by the way. And that's not the real Jesus. And that was never the Jesus that Marcion knew. And then you tack on to Luke this other early church history, which shows all the apostles faithfully obeying Jewish customs until you get to, Paul, and then you have a modification. But even Paul continues with the Jewish customs. Marcion is like, whoa, that's just not true. I mean, this person is completely distorting Galatians, and they have to be doing it willfully because they have to know that Paul opposed the Judaizers, and he's making Paul look like a Judaizer. And that's crazy. So whoever is putting Luke and Acts together has a very definite editorial purpose. They're very consistent in their additions, and you can tell why they're adding stuff. Okay, because they're always following that same purpose: defeat Marcion's view of early Christianity. Early Christianity is something that Marcion said that it wasn't, and that's the version that survives. This is like a key instance of history written by the winners here, folks, because the Evangelion didn't survive, but canonical Luke did. Now, the ironic thing is that in the manuscripts, sometimes bits and pieces of Marcion's Evangelion survived, because when the scribes were copying these out, sometimes they copied out also Marcion's Evangelion and introduced readings from the Evangelion back into canonical Luke. And that's why you have some manuscript variation there.
Oh,
which is interesting.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. Let me get these super chats. This is fun. I'm loving it. Constellation Pegasus. One thing I think about is when the Bible was first allowed to get in public hands, they were immediately starting to find errors in the books. So I think it's just being able to assess the Bible as a layperson, someone actually reading it in their own tongue and evaluating the Bible. I would think that wouldn't the errors come? Well, even Martin Luther was running into some problems. I mean, right out the gate. Hold on. What is going on here? Martin Luther's seeing this problem. But did you want to comment on that?
Well, I would say to this question, yes and no, because, Christians eventually do realize that their gospels don't agree. And in fact, when you read the preface to Luke, and the preface was added by the editor, he doesn't mention Marcion, but he does say, as is well known, that many have laid their hand to, writing a life of Jesus. But basically, I'm going to give you the true version because I've done my research. That's you go read that preface. It's only 4 verses long. And so he tells you that, I'm aware that there's other gospels, and I'm giving you the best version. Okay, so in a sense, Christians were aware that there were differences in the Gospels and definitely differences in the letters. And sometimes it wasn't that they called the differences errors. Sometimes they tried to just reinterpret the material. If you look at 2 Peter, the author of 2 Peter, who's probably mid to late 2nd century, says that, we have the epistles of blessed brother Paul, and we know that many people among you have not interpreted these correctly. And these are very, very hard to interpret. And I'm basically going to give you the right direction, right? So this is the birth of sort of like the canonical reading of Paul. The early Christians don't get rid of Paul. They in the early Catholic tradition, they add a bunch of other falsely named letters under Paul's name, and they give you a tradition for reading Paul. And it's that tradition of reading Paul that is passed on through like Sunday school. So that when you get, when you're introduced to Marcion and you see his reading of Paul, you're like, whoa, heresy, crazy. Oh, I never thought of that. Right. But it's because from childhood, you've been taught a certain way of reading, right? And it's because that tradition has, probably at a very young age for many people, been just integrated, and you've been educated and indoctrinated to think in a certain way about what these writings actually say.
Brings so many questions. Scott Duke, thanks, man. Good to see you. Thank you so much for the super chat. Just making a tuition payment to Myth Vision University. I'm enjoying this stream immensely. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Seriously, everybody in the chat, love you. Go check out Dr. Litwa's Patreon. I'm telling you, there's literature on there that you can gain access to, and he's got private content. You can also message him. This is what we're here for. Thank you for the support. I really appreciate it. Leah, I hope I'm saying that. Leah, I hope I'm pronouncing that. Maybe it's Lee. Forgive me. What would you estimate the writing skill of the author of Luke Acts compares with other known authors of the day? Which makes me also in this question want to have you go way outside of your actual academic comfort zone and tell me, who do you think actually authored it? But anyway, guessing, but please tell us the writing skill first.
Well, it's well known that the author of Acts, who is the reviser of Luke, in my theory, okay, is the best writer of the New Testament. I would say he's the best.
Better than Hebrews?
Well, yeah, Hebrews is the only real competitor. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Besides Hebrews, he's the best. Yeah. So whoever is writing this, we know had to have a really good Hellenic education. He's probably a native speaker of Greek, and he's probably trained to write history. And I think he read Josephus. But anyway, in terms of his vocabulary, his range of vocabulary, his sentence structure, it's all very, very complex and detailed and very smart sounding. Okay. So this is like, if Paul's letter, or if the Gospel of John is like kindergarten level, then Acts is like PhD level writing. Okay, so it's good, and that's another great indication for where this author's social location is. He's not some kind of apostle or sub-apostolic figure writing this as he's within the boat with Paul, and that he's trained to be a doctor, and trust me, doctors aren't trained to write. So he's definitely probably not a doctor. Okay. But he is a very good writer, and his social location and status indicates a man of wealth and means. And I don't think it's important that we don't know his name. The fact that he pretended to be Luke, a companion of Paul, tells us, though, in terms of his location, he was in a church or in an area where apostolic authorship was important. And he knew that he wasn't an apostle. He knew that he couldn't claim to, have an apostle write the book of Acts, but he could, because he knew about Luke from 2 Timothy and Colossians, he could pretend to be Luke, who was a sub-apostolic person, not that well known, and a companion of Paul. So he would be a great person to do like a speech in character. And then you would have this history where people would think, oh my God, we have the earliest history of Christianity, and it's written by a companion of Paul. Man, he saw all this firsthand. Crazy.
What?
No.
This makes me like really, I try not to say stuff's a lie, right? I try to be honest and fair and be like, okay, maybe this is forgery or this is that or whatever. But this sounds like absolute purposeful manipulation. And what if we saw this today? This would be absolutely wrong to do. The question is, did they see this as immoral and a bad thing to be doing? And I'm not saying the people who actually did it, they thought we're doing this for God. Like, people kill in the name of God, people do things in the name of God, and they justify it because they're doing God's work. My thing is, doing what you're describing this author's doing, wouldn't this be bad? Wouldn't this have been like, that is a lie. What you just did is like the biggest of lies, because now you're manipulating material to try and like give the Lord this story and the early church that is supposedly the capital T truth in the way, etc. You see where I'm going with this? If you take like a more strict literalist approach to this, this seems like really bad. I mean, I don't know what to say. It just seems really, really not a good, like, it's not the Christian thing to do.
Well, okay, so but I mean, we can't assume that Christians don't lie for the sake of truth, right?
That's true.
This isn't just Christians. This is anybody who has a very firmly held ideology. It could be, I don't know, it could be anything. Communism. It could be, anti-Semitism. It could be Trumpism. I mean, I don't know, but there's nothing you can do to convince people that what their views are mistaken. And that's what a dogmatist is. It doesn't matter how much evidence, counter evidence you produce, they'll never believe you. So, but the thing is, with religion, you also have this idea that, your beliefs determine salvation. So, you're highly motivated to spread your beliefs, because if you think that people don't believe them, then they will eternally perish. So in that ideology, I think it actually makes good sense to tell a lie for the sake of the truth, because in a sense, it's sort of like, or tell a lie for what you believe is the truth.
Right.
Because,
that's what I was going to say. But yeah.
because you're in a game of salvation, and sometimes in the game of salvation, you have to play dirty. And I think for people opposing Marcion, I honestly think Marcion was so overwhelming to other Christians who disagreed with him.
Yeah.
And we know that there were dozens of treatises written against Marcion. They were just shocked. Well, I mean, and this guy was successful too. So any means to undercut this guy, including rewriting history altogether, just updating the gospel. There you go. I mean, if it's enough to stop this guy, you do it, because it's about, in the end, it just becomes about survival of your community. Are you going to survive as a religious community? You need to do what you do to survive. And I'm not saying it's right, but it is common.
I get it. I get it. And I'm thinking just, wow, you know what I mean? It's to me, I still sometimes go, oh, that's amazing. Just to find that information out. So, thank you so much. I'm going to just say your last name. I think it's Yakov. Thank you so much, my friend. I've seen you around. I just don't want to butcher your name. Thank you for the super chat, and always in the chat as well. Was the virgin birth narratives added to avoid Paul's original sin doctrine, but after the Gospels were written?
Well, I'm really glad that somebody asked this question, because we should really be asking about, what the editor who made canonical Luke actually added. And what he added was 2 chapters at the front. And in those 2 chapters are the entire Christmas story. The thing that, modern people at Christmas love about the Gospel of Luke is all those stories about born of a virgin, the Gabriel comes to Mary, and, then the angels appear to the shepherds, and Zechariah in the temple, and, meeting Gabriel, and wow, that's fun stuff. It's good stories, and it's all Jewish stuff too, because it's so connected with, the Old Testament prophecies, and, women mysteriously getting pregnant. And then it's all very, very Jewish stuff. And bada bing, bada boom, there it is. Whereas Marcion's gospel starts with Jesus just teaching in a synagogue. The editor was not at all happy with that. And so he gave us, yes, the best known account of the virgin birth. And the history of Christianity would never be the same again, okay? Because canonical Luke added that material. It changed the nature of Christianity. All of a sudden, the virgin birth became, or arguably could become, staple Christian doctrine, okay? Now, why add that material? Is it really in any sense anti-Marcionite? Well, in a sense, it is. In a sense, it's also competition with Matthew, because Matthew had a birth narrative, and then the editor of Luke then sort of added the finishing touches, and it's really well written. It's part of the best written part of Luke is that those initial 2 chapters. So about original sin, though, that's Augustine. So you got to wait till early 5th century for Augustine to pull original sin out of Paul. It's a great example of Paul being read through early Catholic eyes. Okay, I mean, 1st and 2nd century readers of Paul were not picking out original sin here. I mean, they would be like, original what? What are we talking about? I mean, that's not there. But it's an interesting question because I mean, it might be a way for the editor of Luke to kind of control your interpretation of Paul's teaching. The only thing that Paul says about Jesus is that he was born of a woman. Okay, Paul never talks about the virgin birth, but ever since that introduction with the virgin birth was added, then people think that it's Christian doctrine that there's a virgin birth, and even though Paul never mentioned the virgin birth and seems to have known nothing about it. So this is a classic case where Marcion would say, hey, you people have distorted Paul's gospel. He never talked about a virgin birth. The birth of Jesus isn't even important. It's the baptism. But lo and behold, the editor becomes canon.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Constellation Pegasus is back. Thank you, my friend. Pastor Russell seems more honest than the gospel writers. Russell at least gave credit to where the Great Pyramid came from for his chronology. Thank you, my friend. I appreciate that. Did you want to comment on that? Or
nope.
Outside of your...
I don't know Pastor Russell.
And by the way, we have literally like 8 minutes left before I have to let Dr. Litwa go. Walka, thank you for the super chat. Derek, you are helping folks bear the cross of fellowship to the truth. It's not easy, but they have to go with the truth. Appreciate what you do. If there's one thing I've said, and I mean this, Dr. Litwa, I mean this for all of our audience, I don't mind wherever people fall ontologically. That's not my job. I don't feel like that's my calling. You know what I mean? I honestly feel like I have been duped, just like our friend Constellation Pegasus. And everyone who's teaching this is also kind of duped. It's like me being raised in a household that I've been raised in to think a particular political party is always right. And I'm leaning this way. And I never educated myself. And actually, even when they try to educate me about politics, they never told me this or that. Or they never really explained to me these things that really don't look so well. That is kind of what I feel like was done with me in Christianity. And I felt like, okay, if you're going to remain a Christian, you at least should be scholarly and try to educate yourself. If not, you might find reasons to find meaning in whatever it is that you find meaning in life. And like Dr. Delcy Allison Jr., at the end of the day, we were in person hanging out for 3 or 4 hours, and I really pinned him. I pressed him, right? And I was like, Dr. Litwa, come on, man. Like, you got to really answer me on this. And he's like, Derek, I had an experience. And I looked at him and I said, sorry, I respect that. Like, I'm not getting into your, like, you had that experience. That's you. You know what I mean? I'm not here to sit here and knock you or whatever. But you know, when he told me that, he's like, I can't prove any of this. This is faith because of my experience. And I respect it. Ian Mills, the same way, you know, interviewed him, Dr. Ian Mills at Duke University. And he was like, yeah, apocalypse failed. Jesus was wrong. And then I had paused the clip and was like, why are you Christian? And he's like, I like Christianity. I like the tradition. I like the morals. I like the teachings. And I was like, so it's not because like, it has to be true all the way through and through. And he's like, I don't know where you grew up and what church you were in. I was like, we were hardcore, man. We really believed like every word. And if it wasn't true, then something's wrong. And that's how we believe. So thank you for that super chat. Sorry for ranting, Dr. Litwa. Is there anything you'd like to say as we're letting you go?
Well, yeah, the point of this exercise, I mean, it's not to be anti-Christian. It's not to be anti-anything. I think there's dogmatism can manifest itself in a variety of ways. Okay, you can be a dogmatist Christian. You can be a dogmatist anything. And the point of scholarship is not to be dogmatist. And a dogmatist is simply someone who will hold on to their ideology regardless of any kind of facts and data that you throw at them. Okay, and the point is please don't be that. Please be somewhere in the middle. There's no point in being extreme. And there's no point in holding something so firmly that there's nothing in the world that could convince you otherwise. Okay. Yeah. the sad thing is, in many evangelical and fundamentalist churches, even the pastors don't even have the sufficient education. They're not actively trying to deceive or misinform. They themselves are actually, they don't know the scholarship, because let's face it, that the educational structure, especially in America, is also controlled by these dogmatic, rules, things that you can and cannot believe. I occasionally look on the American job market, and there are jobs out there that say, we welcome you and we won't discriminate on the basis of color or sexual orientation or whatever, but we expect you to be a Christian.
Sign a statement of faith. Yeah.
So you're discriminating on the basis of creed, and you want me to be involved in an educational system which, in the end, supports a norm of faith, no matter what. Well, sorry, that's not education. That's dogmatism. And the point of education, if it does anything, is to release the dogmatic hold, whatever it is that you hold dogmatically. Okay, release that and learn more about the human situation. We humans were many things, chiefly ignorant. Okay, and we just have to, in the end, just say and humbly admit, we don't know stuff. We don't. And the only way toward knowledge is hard work and labor. And in the end, yeah, we're left a lot with reconstruction and educated guessing. So I'm, through my Patreon and other ways, just trying to give people the means to think like a scholar, so that you aren't carried away basically with somebody who wants to, more or less present some view as if they know it. And they really don't. And the fact is, there's no means to know it. Okay, we're only here educated guessing, and that's who we are.
That's the best thing you can do, is just try to get better on it. We do have some super chats. Can we get those as we go? And no more super chats, please, because I don't want him never wanting to come back. Lee, thank you for the super chat. Pronounced Lee. I appreciate you helping me with the pronunciation. Acts appears to sow a significant amount of confusion into the historical Christian narrative. Is this a fair mindset? Thanks again.
Well, I mean, to me, I would say the author of Acts is trying to make Christianity look a lot more consistent and uniform. Whereas I think this author knows very well that there's all different kinds of Christians. But and the apostles, most of them are invented in the 2nd century, and the importance of the apostles and the traditions about the apostles, this was all stuff that's remembered 50, 60, 70, 80 years after these events supposedly occurred. But what he wants to convince you is that there was this golden age of the church in which everybody was, living basically as, Christian, in a Christian commune in Jerusalem, and everybody was, holding hands and singing hymns and believing the same thing and sharing property, and everything was good. And then, Christianity just kind of went on its course and spread to the Gentiles because God wanted it. But they still had to follow some Jewish customs. And there wasn't a lot of conflict. I mean, the worst conflict that you get in Acts is Barnabas and Paul have a spat and they part company. But in the end, they don't really disagree in terms of the gospel. So it's the whole history of Acts is designed to convince you that Christianity is one. It's a single thing. It's uniform, and it's relentless. And it wasn't. It was none of those things. And that's just a historian trying to convince you of something. And so be careful. Look at the other sources, and you'll see that there's not a lot of agreement. The apostles and the legends of the apostles are 2nd century. And what's important about Christianity is a lot of Christian teaching and memory is 2nd century, not 1st. So keep that in mind.
Thank you so much, Lee. Appreciate the super chat. Mott, thank you for the super chats. As someone in the side chat commented, this is so fringe, but if you want entertainment, Myth Vision is for you. Can you comment on that comment?
Well,
I'll let you comment because they're trying to say what you're saying is fringe. I already know they think I'm crazy, but yeah.
I don't know what is fringe about this. There's hundreds of universities across the globe. Many of them include departments of religion, and some of them will include biblical studies and early Christianity. And this is what we talk about. Okay, we aren't accepting these documents on faith. We're trying to learn where they come from, what their contexts are, who wrote them if possible, and why. So in terms of the academic quest for knowledge about the New Testament, this is anything but fringe. And we're really just trying to do a service here.
Totally agree. Thank you for that super chat, Mod. I hope we answered that properly. The one comment I would say is people are going to come into this chat, especially if they're triggered. I mean, there are people who don't like what I do. And what I do is kind of give you facts that can really unthread a fundamentalist's faith. And it's scary. So what do? You make propaganda. You make derogatory claims. You try to call names or act like they're ridiculous or stupid. And trust me, I get it mainly from a lot of the Muslims when I do Islamic material. They do it even more, but I see a lot of radical Christians do the same thing. So it's kind of a tactic to get you to go, nothing they said is of any weight or value. It doesn't phase my faith. I'm going to remain in cognitive dissonance. What? No, that's me throwing stones back. See, I just did it. I shouldn't have done that. Seriously, though, I'm being funny. My buddy Steven, thank you, my friend. I don't even want to butcher your name for the 666. Thank you. Why did Luke remove both of Matthew's references to Jesus coming only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel?
Well, I wouldn't call it a removal, because the editor is working with the Evangelion, so he's not working with Matthew. He has a general, probably has a general knowledge of Matthew, but what he's trying to do is update Marcion's gospel in an anti-Marcionite direction. Yeah, I mean that's the short answer. I think, I mean, but if you want to just talk about general comparison, one of the reasons why the editor of Luke wouldn't have liked that particular comment from Matthew is that if you look at Acts, the whole point of Acts is the shift of the gospel from Jews to Gentiles. So if you have a saying of Jesus that has, "Oh, I've only come for Israelites," well, that looks really stupid, because then your whole next book is about him being relevant for Gentiles. So that's not going to work. So, I mean, these writers, they're all saying different things and they're all trying to be consistent. So I hope you can see the logic.
Yeah. No, my buddy Steven definitely sees that. So interesting way to put it. I think we both agree with you on that to a certain degree. I don't know. I don't know, Stephen. Do you think that Luke knew Matthew and was maybe trying to redact? I don't know. That's a different question. And maybe there is something to it. Who knows? But you're still in agreement on that idea that Luke is shifting away from what we see Matthew say. Matthew says some crazy stuff, as well as like, I came only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Whoa. I don't think Luke wanted that. And he didn't put it in there. So thank you. Myth Wisdom Podcast. I noticed you commented the other day and said, whoa, what an interesting name. Myth Wisdom Podcast. Thank you. What is the possibility that these forgeries, and this is the last one, Dr. Little, what is the possibility that these forgeries were done between the 14th and 19th century by authors William Tyndale, Erasmus, Miles Coverdale, etc.? What forgeries?
Not likely. Yeah.
Oh, here, by forgeries include the four gospels as well as the letters of the an epistle. Oh, heck no. There's some people who literally have like completely different chronologies and stuff. But anyway, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, you have to go based on evidence here, and we actually have over 5,000 physical manuscripts of the New Testament, and they're all almost all, 90% of them date before the 14th century. So we have physical evidence that these documents existed, and we've even got full copies of the New Testament from the 4th century. So that's 1,000 years before Erasmus. So not much of a chance.
I almost want to play this on our way out just so everybody gets the gist, because some people will probably still think like this.
You mean not good like 1 out of 100?
I'd say more like 1 out of a million.
So you're telling me there's a chance? Yeah!
Just being ridiculous. Thank you, Dr. Litwa. I mean, seriously, sitting through and being patient and dealing with me, you're going to heaven for that, just so you know. I know that for a fact. But everybody, please, I'm not plugging this Patreon for no reason. I'm asking on behalf of a scholar, a friend, someone who's trying to be able to educate people more who have these questions and take the time. And I can tell you, as a married man, trying to justify my reasonings to my wife, you know, hey, look, this is a way that helps to provide for the family and what we do for a living. It matters to have that support. So when you want a question asked, you know, Dr. Litwa can also try and do that. And there's a lot of tiers. I joined it. Please consider helping and supporting the scholars that I bring on the channel. There's so many interesting things that Dr. Litwa brings up. And there are interviews exclusively for the Patreon by both Gnostic Informant, Nil, and me here at Myth Vision, where we have put this up here, and I'm going to continue doing interviews with him that are exclusively only on the Patreon, so you can gain your own gnosis in this field. It's affordable, and it helps Dr. Litwa want to come back, because who wants to come talk to me? I mean, let's be honest, right, Dr. Litwa?
Can't agree with you there.
Okay, well, I'm trying to do something here. He has plenty of books. If you haven't read, like, the Evil Creator, really love that one. It's just mind-blowing how early Christians, early Jesus followers, thought the God of the Hebrew Bible was evil. I mean, mind blown. Of course, the church will tell you they were heretics and they weren't following the truth, etc. But what is that? Do we really know what it really was? The original version of Christianity? Do we have confidence in knowing that? Anyway, get closer to the truth by reading some of these works. I look forward to talking to you more on these and bringing more material. Consider joining Myth Vision's Patreon. I mean, I'm endlessly working. If I'm not recording a live, I'm pre-recording something that's getting edited that'll end up on the Patreon, and you will have early access to that. So now, a real final word from you, Dr. Litwa, before I let you go.
Well, just thanks to everybody for having the patience to work through this with me. And so we got the Marcion episode going to be on the Patreon soon, and I'm offering 20% off there for if you want to grab the book Found Christianities. Just punch in a code and you can get some money off there. And thank you so much for joining and for being part of this discussion. So do take